Number 10, The Final Hike. In September 2021, a Virginia woman was found dead in Montana's Glacier National Park just days after she'd been reported missing. 34-year-old Jennifer Coleman was an avid hiker who loved to explore the wilderness. She was super excited to tackle the 2 trails at Logan's Pass, but little did she know it turned out to be her final hike. National parks don't usually have cell reception, especially if you're deep in the woods, so when she went missing, it took a few days for someone to notice. In fact, it was her empty car in the parking lot that drew officials' attention and led to a rescue team looking for her. The search party of nearly 50 people was formed on a Friday as they all set out on a quest to find Jennifer and get her back to safety. But the feeling of dread started to grow with each passing hour of searching, and by Sunday, hopes of her survival had vanished. Everyone's fears finally came true when her body was found in a steep and rocky area next to the Continental Divide. Not only did her death send shockwaves across the hiking community, but it sent a ton of safety awareness foundations into motion. Interestingly enough, the cause of her death remains shrouded in mystery to this very day. Number 9, Unknown Hazards. In August 2021, a California national forest was closed down after a couple was found dead on a trail. The cause of their death? No one really knows. 45-year-old Jonathan Garish was out for a nice family vacation in Sierra National Forest with his 31-year-old wife Ellen Chung, their 1-year-old daughter, and their family dog. To be fair, it would have been a weekend to remember if only Mother Nature hadn't come with other plans for them. The scorching sun brought out the heat while the inner trails harbored toxic gas. A couple of days into their fun hiking trip, a family friend reported that they'd gone missing since no one had heard from them. This obviously led to search parties being formed to find and retrieve them. Also, while the trail they were on was full of trees and shade, the unforgiving sun managed to raise the temperatures to over 109 degrees or just under 43 degrees Celsius that day. Plus, the trail also had some algae poisoning in the water in that area, which officials did warn everyone about. It seems like the family didn't heed the warnings though, since their dead bodies were found on the Mariposa County hiking trail just a few days later. Now here's where it gets interesting. Apparently, the cause of their death was chalked up to unknown hazards in the area. The officials just couldn't pinpoint what exactly killed them. But in all seriousness, there were no signs of carbon monoxide poisoning from the mines, consumption of toxic chemicals, or even any strange things like guns or other weapons. And for this very reason, the trail was closed down for all tourists while panic ensued all over their mysterious deaths. Number 8, Leap of Faith. In January 2022, a San Diego teacher was found dead by some hikers at the base of a granite formation in Joshua Tree National Park. 35-year-old Michael Spitz was a high school Spanish teacher at the Santa Fe Christian School who loved to hike and climb rock formations during his free time. So it was just a normal day in his life when he decided to head over to the California National Park for a weekend adventure. His goal? To do the 100-foot classic Illusion Dweller climb to the top of the Sentinel Granite Formation all by himself. Oh, and while it might sound scary to a rookie, this wasn't his first rodeo. As a matter of fact, he actually used this climb as a warm-up for more difficult ones nearby, and he knew it like the back of his hand. Besides, he'd free-soloed 5,000 feet or just about 1.5-kilometer climbs before, making this child's play in comparison. So no one really knows what happened that made him stumble and fall 80 feet or just about 24 meters to the ground at around 5 p.m. that Sunday. What makes the fall even more brutal is the fact that he didn't die on the spot. Instead, he survived the fall and passed at some point that night. It wasn't until 10 a.m. the next day when hikers stumbled upon his dead body. Apparently, Michael romanticized solo climbing and felt extremely confident in his ability, so much so that he was convinced he couldn't fall. But it was one of the easier climbs that claimed his life. Would you rather climb down a mountain or bungee jump straight into a ravine? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Number 7, Lost in the Woods. In July 2017, a woman's dead body was found in the Sam Houston National Forest after she'd been reported missing by her husband. 55-year-old Teresa Kirkpatrick was out with her husband Alan to pick up a motorcycle that got stuck in the woods off Stubblefield Lake Road. And at some point during the search, she lost contact and straight up disappeared. Now at this point, the wise thing would have been to report the incident to officials, but Alan decided it would be a good idea to keep searching for her by himself, and after almost 8 hours of no luck, he finally gave up and headed to the police. Search parties were formed, and a day later her body was found deep inside the forest. Here's where it gets interesting. Her brother Kaiser claims that Alan killed her. Why? Well, according to him, she couldn't have gone into the wilderness alone because she had a bad back, suffered from diabetes, high blood pressure, and emphysema. What's more, she couldn't even bear the heat of her own porch for 30 minutes, so there's no doubt she couldn't handle a national forest. On top of that, her medical condition didn't let her go hiking or ride bikes, which makes this whole situation so suspicious. Oh, and apparently, Ellen also had a history of physical abuse, as Kaiser and some of the family members had to step in at times to defend her. But while there was definitely a precedent of violence there, the sheriff's department didn't actually find any visible signs of trauma on her body. Number 6. Freak Show. Last year in September, the disappearance of a social media influencer made international headlines when her fiancé returned from a road trip without her. 22-year-old Gabby Petito and her fiancé Brian Laundrie had a pretty wide social media presence as they documented their ambitious journey across the country. And one of the big staples of their adventure was how many different national parks they could visit. Everything looked great from the outside until social media updates stopped one day in August, and things really took a dark turn a week later when Brian returned from the journey without Gabby alongside him. At this point, he refused to talk to the police or even her family. Also, they couldn't contact Gabby either. In fact, the last text she sent out was around the same time their social media went dark, sparking even more suspicions about her safety. So with Brian not saying anything, her family reported her missing, and before the police could even trace her location, Brian bailed and disappeared himself. 2 days after this, though, Gabby's body was found in Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming with clear signs of strangulation. Now, this obviously meant they had had a fight and Brian had murdered her on the trip. Oh, and apparently the last text that she had sent, that was sent by him too. But everyone got the shock of their lives when, after a month of searching, Brian's own skeletal remains were found inside the Carlton Reserve in Sarasota, Florida. So maybe there were even darker forces at play here. The case is still fresh in our minds though, and our hearts go out to Gabby's loved ones. Number 5. Into the Rainstorm. In April 2017, a mountain biker rode into the rainstorm in Olympic National Park and would never be seen alive again. 22-year-old Jacob Gray was fascinated by the idea of being one with nature and regularly went on trips throughout national parks with his bike. Little did he know, though, that his wishes of reconnecting with nature would unfold in the most tragic way possible. His last outing in Washington proved deadly as he cycled his way through a rainstorm to a summit at a nearby hill, but much to the dismay of his father Randy, he never made it back. Jacob's bike and gear were found on the side of a trail, and it looked like he'd been prepping a campsite nearby, since the tarp and other equipment were lying on the ground. He, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen, so his father sold his house, closed his business, and rallied some people to search for his beloved missing son. He spent months looking, all the while thinking what could have happened to his dear boy. Many thoughts crossed his mind, including accidents, murder, or even self-harm, as Jacob did have a history of some mental health issues. By August, he'd all but given up his search when he got a phone call that a group of researchers found Jacob's body much higher on the mountain than anyone would have thought, and the cause of death was labeled as hypothermia. Now, while Randy had lost his son to the forces of nature, at least he found peace in the fact that even during his final moments, he made his father proud by pushing himself and reaching new heights. Number 4. Vanished into thin air. In June 2021, an Irishman visiting Grand Teton National Park mysteriously disappeared without a trace, and to this day, his remains have yet to be found. 27-year-old Sion McLaughlin loved finding new trails and often went hiking during his time off, so it wasn't unusual for him to visit a national park to appreciate the grand scope of it. What was strange, though, was the fact that after his mini Wyoming vacation, he didn't show back up at work. McLaughlin was then reported as missing, with his last sighting putting him somewhere in the direction of Taggart Lake. His car was also found parked near the area. Now, the thing about this lake is that its 8-mile or just under 13-kilometer trail is notoriously difficult, and according to witnesses, he wasn't carrying a backpack, which is usually a recipe for disaster. At the same time, the trail was apparently one of his favorites, and he'd been through it multiple times. 45 helicopter rounds, high-tech tools, flyers, posters, hashtags, and literally everything was thrown into the search for Sion, who seemed like he'd vanished into thin air. Plus, false reports of his sighting didn't help either. In fact, one of these leads from 40-year-old Heather Miskaki led the police on a 500-hour wild goose chase, which resulted in her getting banned from the national park for 5 years. Despite everyone's continued efforts, Sion's remains still haven't been found, and his disappearance still puzzles minds to this day. Number 3. Fight for life. In October 2020, a California woman went missing for over 10 days in the cruel wilderness of Utah's Zion National Park. 38-year-old Holly Suzanne Cordier was set to go on a spiritual pilgrimage to unwind and rediscover herself, but the only thing she found was despair and agony. After getting dropped off by a private shuttle bus at the national park, Holly was supposed to roam around and come back 4 hours later to join the rest of the tourists, but she never did. Search parties were sent out to look for her as she turned into an online sensation, with people speculating all sorts of things about the case. Some even called her family's fundraiser a big scam, saying that the story of her disappearance didn't make sense. Also, she left her phone behind, so there was no way of even contacting the woman either. Even after a week of extensive searching, Suzanne was nowhere to be seen. This was not her time to die, though. After 10 long days of searching, she was found. Holly was famished, many pounds lighter, and extremely dehydrated. She was also concussed, had kidney failure, and multiple foot injuries thanks to hypothermia. But most of all, what she did have was the will to live, as she brilliantly survived her way through the wilderness for over a week and returned a hero for living through it all. It must have been some spiritual journey for sure. Number 2, nowhere to be found. In May 2013, a man in the Canadian Army Reserve went on a 1,700-mile or just over 2,700-kilometer road trip to Glacier National Park and never made it home. 25-year-old Pradeep Shran was an exchange student on Australia's Gold Coast when he randomly decided to drive to Melbourne to hike up some mountains. So he rented a van, drove up to the national park's Charlotte Pass, and set out on his quest to summit the peak in dense snow. But of course, he never returned from the journey. In fact, no one even noticed he disappeared until the rental company reached out to his family to ask about the missing vehicle. And from that point on, the search for Shran began. Now, we don't quite know for how many days after his disappearance the search started, since people only found out about it when the van's rental time had expired. So for all intents and purposes, he could have been missing for weeks. After 2 weeks of searching, the Australian authorities called off the search. Shran's parents then hired private investigators to look for him, and using the hike plans found on his laptop in the van and some other tower data from his phone, they were able to track his trail to the treacherous Western Fall Wilderness. But despite a year-long private search, his body was never found. Number 1, Glacier of Death. In July 2022, Montana's Glacier National Park claimed the life of 3 experienced climbers, all within just a few days of each other. 67-year-olds Brian Kennedy and Jack Beard were climbing partners and regularly visited national parks to seek thrills. In fact, they'd been hiking Glacier's towering peaks for decades, and often visited so often that the park staff knew them personally. So it was a shocking revelation when they didn't return home as planned 3 days after they'd started their journey. It didn't take long for rescuers to find their bodies, as they'd taken a pretty common path. With that being said, the cause of their death remains unknown. They weren't the only ones to suffer this fate during that week, though. Just a day after their bodies been found, 79-year-old Bob Biondi from Florida also fell to his death while climbing off a steep trail slope on the Rising Wolf Mountain with some of his friends. And while officials say these 2 incidents weren't linked to each other, they're also a stark reminder of the risks involved with climbing rock formations that can fall apart so easily right under your feet. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be lost in a national park alone for 3 days or get attacked by a wild animal while hiking? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time on The Bad Badger.